And we are live. Go ahead, John.
Good evening, bonsoir. My name is John Hubday, and I'm a member of the English Language Cultural Program Committee of the Jewish Public Library. Wherever you are, I am very pleased to welcome you to this week's edition of the JPL's Book Talks. And this innovative series is being presented under the auspices of the Rosalind Goodman Cultural Institute. Now, before I introduce this evening's author, I want to express my thanks, and I feel sure the thanks of all of you, to Roxana Brons and Maria Resiner, who, working from their homes, have used their creative and technical skills that have made this virtual literary salon possible. This evening, we're going to have the pleasure of hearing from Montreal-based writer Mary Soderstrom. She has written 6 novels, as well as nonfiction, 3 short story collections, and even a children's book. Her next book, Concrete: From Ancient Origins to a Problematic Future, will be published in October. In a few minutes, if the technology works well, Mary Soderstrom will read from and discuss her book, Frenemy Nations, Wondering Why the US and Canada Are So Different. I'm sure that all of you, particularly in recent months, have been asking yourselves the same question. Now, I will hand you over to Mary Soderstrom. Mary.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's sort of a little bit strange to be talking about the differences between the US and Canada at a time in which they've never seen gray. I mean, all you have to look at Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau, and you get a picture of what's, I mean, Trump is no longer orange. He seems to have stopped dying. Certainly he is up and around and about, and obviously seeing makeup people and not necessarily following the best rules for social physical isolation, whereas Justin Trudeau's hair keeps getting longer and longer, and obviously he's an example for all of us that we shouldn't rush to the hairdresser when against the regulations of the council of the public health authorities. Anyway, one of the things about this particular time, well, first of all, I'll talk about the book. It's called Frenemy Nations, Love and Hate Between Neighboring States. It's published by the University of Regina Press. And that's actually not the title that I wanted originally. I call it Unidentical Twins, places that, why some places that are alike aren't alike. But my publisher said that he thought that you mention twins in the title and it'll end up in the parentings of bookstores. So they went looking for another title. In it, I look at 10 pairs of places, political entities that are alike and not alike, and they are, there's a whole lot of them. But I began by thinking about the United States and Canada, 50 years ago, when I first came to Montreal. And let's see, when we came here, I had no idea that in the summer of 1968, that we didn't expect the things would be different. I mean, we knew there would be some differences, but Canada and the United States, I thought, were very much alike. They were supposedly loving democracies with a high standard of living and a history of free speech. The differences that we knew about when we came here from California sounded like really interesting things. People spoke French, all we understood. That sounded like fun. And also beer had a higher alcohol content, and that was all to the good also. And more important at that time was that Canada was not involved in the war in Vietnam. Now, my husband was not a draft dodger for various reasons. He had deferments, but very just sick of that war, and which I think most people now believe was a great mistake. Anyway, so it wasn't as simple as all that. And in later years, I've often said that if I had 6 months of not worrying about the States, and then after the 6 months when I began to realize what was going on in Canada and in Quebec, I ended up having two places to worry about. Okay, my question at that point, what makes the difference? And I started looking far afield as I lived here longer. And the 10 places that I came up with, I mean, I've traveled quite a bit over the years and thought quite a bit about the places I traveled. Before we started this, one of the members of the committee asked me, when did you start writing the book? And I said 50 years ago. That's not really an exaggeration, because the first places that I thought I wondered about what they are like, but they're not alike, Vietnams, which were in 1968. The key to the war in Vietnam was, who was going to unite Vietnam as a country? Was it going to be the North or the South? That's one. Then also I ended up at Algeria and Tunisia, Kerala and Tamil Nadu states in southern India, Brazil and the rest of Latin America. I mean, the question is, why does Brazil speak Portuguese and everybody else speaks Spanish? Good, interesting stories. This actually sounds like a bit like some Game of Thrones. Haiti and the Dominican Republic, who same island, but they're very different histories. Burundi and Rwanda, who also are very much alike and had similar ethnic conflicts, and at this point seem to be going in different directions. Scotland and Ireland, the Celtic, part of this, the Celtic great culture, who also are very different in many respects. And then Vermont, New Hampshire. I mean, there's Vermont, the home of Bernie Sanders and his peculiar form of socialism. And New Hampshire is live free or die. Why are they different? And then Alberta and Saskatchewan, the home, Tommy Douglas and Stephen Harper. All these questions, all these places were so different that I really did a lot of thinking about it. But the big one, of course, is the United States and Canada. Certainly what differentiates the United States and Canada is not the border, which is for most of its length, completely arbitrary. Supposedly Americans are more individualistic, violent, litigious, innovative, and open. Canadians are more peaceful, polite, concerned about the collective welfare, and more inclined to follow orders. The received wisdom is that the two countries' differences can be summed up in their mottos: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness versus peace, order, and good government. Anyway, but the differences in Canada and the United States are go much deeper. And at this writing, the life expectancy and infant survival rates, income equity, stability, and the school children's rankings on international education tests are all higher in Canada than in the United States. On the other hand, if you own a weapon, pay lower taxes, or want to pass your winter in a place which is usually less snowy, the United States is the place to be. Okay, I think I lost my place. Okay, I want to read a little bit about what we thought of when we came here, and it will give you some. It's a particular section I think is particularly appropriate today, which is the day of the funeral of George Floyd, and as it comes after 2 weeks of protest around the world against systemic racism, the idea of really ingrained societal prejudice against people. But this take you back to August of 1968, when we drove across the country from San Francisco area to Montreal. When I think about that Sunday in 1968, when we crossed the US-Canada border, I try to remember what felt different in our new country. What we saw in Detroit probably sums it up. Little more than a year earlier, a large part of the city had burned during a fire race riot that started when police raided an after-hours drinking spot. By the end of the conflict, sometimes called the Detroit Rebellion, 43 persons were dead, 1,189 injured, and more than 7,000 arrested. The material damage was also substantial, amounting to about $280, $290 million in today's dollars. We knew this, but on the Sunday morning when we arrived, we would just get off the freeway and take a look around because my husband had a friend who was teaching at Wayne State University, and we thought it would be fun to where the university was and what the country looked like. We didn't intend to drop in because the sun was just coming up, and that's not a very good thing to do. But we lost our way and found ourselves driving down deserted streets lined with burnt out buildings and rubble. This is a year later, after the riots. In the end, we must have stopped at a store or service directions. It's all sort of vague now. But eventually we made it downtown, where, still a little shaken by what we'd seen, we went to the nicest hotel we could find to eat breakfast and wash up a little. Now, for reasons which are not relevant to this story, we had driven from Omaha, Nebraska, which was almost 24 hours, and we were just really ruddy. And we were going to cross the border at Windsor, and we wanted to at least look like we actually the night before. The breakfast was good and the welcome cordial. And a professional baseball team was in town to play the Detroit Tigers. My husband, with his crew cut, looked like he might be a baseball player. The man at the next table even told him that his team had played really well the day before. Then as we left, we found a black man with a shopping cart and a sleeping bag over his shoulder, crouching just outside the hotel's grounds. Homeless, probably, and something I hadn't encountered before. He got up quickly and took off, approached. The contrast couldn't have been greater when we landed it. We were sure that we didn't have problems like this that produced the Detroit riots. Winds across the Detroit River in Ontario was cleaner, we saw immediately. There were no burnt out buildings. Folks were polite in the working class neighborhood where we stopped on the way out of town to buy provisions. Pardon me, the young man behind the counters at the convenience store asked when he didn't catch the person in front of him had asked him. Sorry, someone else said when he brushed past us on the way out. We would soon learn that slavery had been legal in Canada until the 1830s, that generations of Indigenous Canadians have suffered from policies that many qualify as genocide, that prejudice continues against African Canadians and other people of color, and that homelessness would become commonplace in Canadian citizens. Yet the viciousness of American racism was absent. It's telling that the Americans had to fight in slavery, but in Canada, it was outlawed after debate in the British Parliament. The bill passed nearly 30 years before Abraham Lincoln decreed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. As I said before, I'm not going to whitewash Canada, but I think there are degrees of horribleness, and Canada comes out on the better end of it. Okay, after this, we continued. We reached Montreal on the afternoon of a hot, muggy Labor Day, going down Sherbrooke Street, clad lawn bowlers in West, who seemed the antithesis of the poor man outside the hotel in Detroit. No road signs in kilometers, no temperatures in Celsius, few signs in French. That would come later as Canada changed, but we weren't in Kansas anymore, Toto. So anyway, it's like that. Our introduction to Canada. Certainly, like many Americans, we never really thought very much about why there might be differences. Most Americans, Canada, until recently, is more likely to be part of a punchline and a joke. The comedian, late lamented Robin Williams put it, "You are the kindest country in the world. You are a really nice apartment over a meth lab." Okay, and Canada also has been seen by Americans as a place to escape to in times of trouble. Two stars of 20th century American literature, Philip Roth in The Plot Against America, published in 2000, and Sinclair Lewis in It Can't Happen Here, which was published in 1930, portrayed Canada as a place where people could get away from the clutches of a fascist, brutal, racist government that has taken over the United States. Margaret Atwood did much of the same thing in her novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which was published in 1985. But that's perhaps to be expected because after all, she's a Canadian nationalist. But it's worth noting that these three novels were written at three different points in time over 7 decades, which a malaise about politics has a long history. Okay, why is that? Well, academics argue that the French or Quebec institutions are one of the main root causes of the major the differences in the strategies of the British and French, what they used it to in colonizing North America, cast a long shadow. Both of the colonizing powers presumed that they could claim land without compensating or even consulting the indigenous population. But one conquest was much more peaceful. The early French settlement and trade took place against the background of war among various indigenous tribes. The 5 nations of the Iroquois were fighting for control of that became both New France and New England. And Samuel de Champlain in 1609 took Algonquin warriors and went south down the Richelieu River and into Lake Champlain, and he was earned the wrath of Iroquois, and because they had with various raids, and 2 Iroquois warriors were killed. And Iroquois raids on French settlements in the St. Lawrence Valley after that continued over 30 years. But, and this is a big but, by the end of the 17th century, it became clear that the coexistence among the various indigenous nations and could be mutually advantageous. And the Great Peace of Montreal, which perhaps you remember because there was stuff on the 400th anniversary of it, the 300th anniversary of it, it was negotiated and signed and so won by 40 representatives of various tribes in the French establishment. And that led to relatively cordial relations between the indigenous population and the French until the end of the 7 Years' War. When I grew up in the States, I learned that this was not this war, this was the French and Indian War, because in the British colonies, the indigenous population and the French against the British. In 1704, only 3 years after the Great Peace of Montreal, a joint French and indigenous force raided the village of Deerfield in Massachusetts colony. And it was just only one of many incidents on the New England frontier that was matched by conflict with it further to the south in the Appalachians. And more, the historian has said that this continued state of armed uncertainty left a lasting mark on the American psyche, as much, if not more, than the shadow of slavery. One historian asserts that because of the American experience, the country's founding myth insists on violence to overcome the forces of darkness, which may be defined as the indigenous population, other nations, rogue individuals, or anybody who's not like us. Okay. A direct result of the violence between the settlers and the indigenous and on the frontier is that the persons who claim indigenous heritage today make up a considerably smaller proportion of the US population than they do in Canada. In 2000, 4.3% of the Canadian population claimed indigenous heritage. In the United States, it was just 1.5%. And what this means is, in effect, the Americans were more successful in emptying the land of the indigenous population. Groups were effectively exploited, while others, particularly in New England and the West, were chased across the medicine line, which is what the indigenous people call the border. Anyway, a Canadian of indigenous people has been and still is shameful. Anyway, there's much higher suicide and disease rates in First Nations communities are much higher than elsewhere. And the charges of systemic racism are what we're hearing all the time. South of the border, indigenous population's current condition receives some attention. It has another problem. The United States has another problem, which takes up a larger place in its history, and that's the enslavement people imported from Africa and their descendants. Slavery was the economic foundation of many of the 13 colonies. It was the reason for the Civil War. And although Americans elected an African-American president twice, the tensions between Black and white people in the States remains high. All we need to do is read the paper today, check out YouTube. Anyway, okay. It's interestingly enough, Canada was the destination on the Underground Railroad, waves escaping during the period before the American Civil War. But actually, there were only about 30 or 40,000 people who came up that way, and Canadians' population, African descended population, has come more recently, most of them from Caribbean and interestingly enough, they came in the beginning in the 1990s when Canada changed its immigration system from, well, was sort of a chaotic sort of thing to one in which it was and still is point-based. And so people came because they were chosen because they had skills. I mean, I remember that we were one of the first cohorts of people who got our landed immigrant status by points. And I could have come in, I remember the guy in Windsor's, all right, you can come in our husband's points, but why don't we do you an evaluation too? So I got in on my points, and I didn't realize the importance of that, but it is an important thing. Okay. Slavery left its scars on the United States. But at least one historian says it's the constant and early confrontation with the indigenous population on the frontier that established a pattern of violence in American society. Militias to fight indigenous people were among the first community organizations formed by Americans. And this carryover from the frontier mentality is used as a justification by a sizable and influential part of American society to refuse to do anything about regulating firearms today. Indeed, one of the biggest differences between the US and Canada is closely linked to Americans' passion for firearms. The per capita homicide rate south of the border has been about 3 times for the last 50 years. Okay, and then there is the fact that since the Second World War, Canada and its provinces have cobbled together a network of other social programs that provide a safety far stronger than anything found south of the border. This is despite the fact that the United States arguably had a better social program and more income equity during the New Deal of the 1930s and the wartime wage controls in the 1940s. This is what Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, points out, that the US, for whatever reason, during a period in the sort of the middle of the 20th century, a lot of good things going for it. In fact, the Canada Pension Plan was instituted a full 30 years after the United States became Social Security in 1935. So what you've got a situation where Americans had, whatever reason, had social programs during part of the 20th, but beginning in the 1970s, the United States saw a systematic effort by right-wing forces with lots to undo the reforms of the New Deal. In Canada, attempts have been made also to dismantle the social safety net, but they have been much less successful. One reason for this may be Canada's more stringent campaign finance regulations and mega money out of elections. Conservative forces with deep pockets have much influence when they can't buy elections easily. Since 2015, only individual Canadians, not corporates, not unions, can contribute at most $1,500 a year per party, and any contribution over $200 must be published. In the United States, however, individuals can give $2,700 to candidates, as many candidates as you want, and up to $107,000 to national committee accounts. Now, I don't know how they got $107,000, but that's a fair amount of money. And in addition, there are individual expenditure-only political committees called super PACs sometimes. And they may accept unlimited contributions from anywhere in the world, including corporations, legal organizations, and offshore interests. that makes a big difference in who gets elected in a country. And so you have a situation where you're going on one path and you get turned off another path. There's also the fact that there's many other things, but one of the other things I think that sort of piggybacks on this situation is that there's a certain amount of self-selection between the two countries. It's played an important part in nation movements at other points in Canadian history. An example is when Medicare was brought in the 1970s, there was a lot of hue and cry in the medical community about science medicine, and a certain number of physicians and healthcare professionals went south to avoid that. Whereas the people many others stayed, and so essentially physicians left, and the people who believed in the idea of single payer healthcare stayed in Canada. Now, in more recent years, so like in the last 10 years, there has been a huge movement, but there has been a movement of young American doctors who have been upset with the way healthcare insurance and the whole system has been bungled in the States, who have come to Canada. And so you get where you get people who think one way into one country and people who think another way going into another country. In other words, a significant number of people who don't like going on, don't not like going on, will leave. And essentially, that in some respects, that's what my husband and I did, is that we left. And so I don't know what we would be if we had stayed in the United States. Probably considerably more frustrated with what's going on, but we're here in Canada, and I wrote this book as I was trying to figure out what the differences are. These are only some of the differences that I came up with, and there are others which apply to other places. But the one about self-selection, I think, is more important as time goes on. So anyway, that's short. That's essentially what I have to say. Any questions?
Mary, there may be questions that will come later, and people can enter them on Facebook, I understand.
Yeah, I'll check tomorrow.
And over the course of the next 24 hours, presumably. But I really want to thank you very, very much for sharing your fascinating observations of some of the differences between the Americans and Canadians. It really has been, I think, I'm motivated to read your book, so I would like you to hold up the cover one more time. And would you mention the name of the publisher?
Okay, it sure is at University of Regina Press.
Okay.
And it's available from independent booksellers. Most of them can order it for you. It's available as an ebook where you can get from usual sources. There's also the McNally Robinson booksellers in Saskatoon will ship all over the country. And I know that a number of local bookshops will order it. And you probably can find it at Chapters, and I know you can get it at Paragraph too.
Very, very, very valuable reading. I wish you could hear and enjoy the applause and nods of approval of the countless people who have already logged on to show their appreciation of your presentation on this evening's edition of Open Books. And I would like to, in closing, on behalf of each and every one of them, all of these unseen people, to thank you, many, many thanks, and our best good wishes for the success, not only of this book, but of all of your future writings. Before closing, I would also like to thank Roxana Bronze and Maria Resina for their work in bringing you this series from the Montreal Jewish Public Library. It's a wonderful way to reach out to so many book lovers such as yourselves in your own homes. We're certainly living in very challenging times for the Jewish Public Library as it's had to close its doors. However, I urge you to use every opportunity to contact others who share your own passion for literature and to make sure that the JPL's online programs, such as Open Books, receive the recognition and acclaim that they deserve. So be watching out for that. And these are services which the Jewish Public Library has been really, really pleased to initiate during this very difficult time. And so, on behalf of everyone, good evening, bonne soirée.
Thank you again for the invitation.